Hello, and welcome to this LinkedIn live session from Fuqua School of Business. I'm really thrilled to be here. My name is Dan Vermeer, and I'm a professor of the practice at the Fuqua School of Business. I also am an adjunct professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment, and I'm the executive director for the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment. And so this presentation that I'm doing today is focused on the Arctic, and I want to just take a moment to give you a little bit of background on why this is an area that's become interesting to me. I have long-term interest and involvement around issues of climate and energy, but more recently I've become really fascinated with the importance of oceans, both as a place that is experiencing great change because of climate and other impacts, but also because it's an area where I think there is enormous opportunity for innovation and business growth in ways that actually could align with the ecosystem in a better way. And so that interest in oceans brought me to Norway, and then ultimately to the Arctic as a site where I think some really interesting and important issues are happening. They're playing out in that region in ways that I think have global significance, but aren't really on the global radar. So I wanted to take some time today just to give you a little bit of background. I have two goals in this presentation. The first one is I want to be able to give you a broad perspective on the issues and challenges of quote unquote sustainable development in the Arctic. And then the second part of the presentation, I want to give you a bit of detail about two specific programs we have that touch the Arctic in various ways. I'm going to give a lot of sort of thumbnail sketches today of some of the businesses we've worked with and some of the challenges they're facing, just to give you a better, more tangible sense of what's actually playing out in the area. And my goal in this presentation is for you to be able to open the aperture from issues that you would see if you're reading the newspaper or media at this point. There's probably not a lot of coverage on things like the Arctic, but I think business plays a critical role in this global issue. I think all of us as citizens need to be engaged around these issues about high risk, high reward sort of investment and engagement in different parts of the world. And I think it really sharpens our lens as we think about how do we balance the desire we have for economic growth on one hand and improve quality of life and healthy ecosystems on the other. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. I'd like to share my slides. So I titled the slide, the presentation today is Sustainable Development of the Arctic Possible? And this issue comes up for a variety of reasons. One is that the Arctic region is actually the place where the idea of sustainability or sustainable development actually originated from. Harlem Grove Brundtland was the head of an UN commission back in the 80s that coined this idea of sustainable development. And essentially the idea was, how do we meet our needs for today's growth and development without sacrificing the ability of future generations to do the same, to meet their needs and to flourish. And so this is a really powerful idea. It's a challenging idea because often the dictates of how you develop and how you sustain don't necessarily align. So the art and science of sustainable development is balancing these two things that are very difficult to actually achieve both in practice. And so how do we do that? Through technological means, through policy means, through new business models. This is really the question of sustainable development. And these issues are so live in the Arctic because until recently, it was relatively untouched. And that is definitely not the case at this point. So I wanted to give you a bit more background on that. So what is the Arctic anyway? This is a term that we use, but people might actually have different ideas about what the Arctic actually constitutes. The most common reference is to the Arctic Circle, which is the southernmost latitude that you have days where no sun shines at all. So that's the Arctic Circle. Anything inside that circle is considered the Arctic by one definition. But there's also definitions based on the relative temperature of different parts of the Arctic. So the 10 degrees C July isotherm measure is the yellow line. That's a bit different than what the Arctic Circle is. There's also ways of mapping this out in terms of what's the flora and fauna that grow in these regions. There's also mapping according to where the people, the indigenous populations especially, as well as the people who have migrated into these places, where they're living. So all of these are slightly different definitions, which constitute different sort of parts of the region. But roughly, this is the idea of the Arctic. Um, Let me give you just a little bit of a thumbnail about Arctic society and how it's governed. There's about 4 million people total in the Arctic, and of these, about 10% are indigenous peoples that belong actually to lots of different groups. You can see in the map on the right all of the different types of indigenous people and where they are most commonly found across the Arctic region. In most countries, those indigenous populations are a minority, with the exception of Greenland, where 90% is actually indigenous. The Arctic Council has formed over the last couple of decades as a high-level intergovernmental forum that addresses issues of the Arctic in a collective way. Since the countries that are involved here, there are 8 that have sovereignty in the region. Those include Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the U.S. Through our state of Alaska. And so those are the formal members of the Arctic Council, but there are more and more countries around the world which are declaring an interest in this region with, for example, China calls themselves a near Arctic country. Why are they doing that? Because there is greater and greater interest and potential for the economic development of the region. So this is pressure that's growing every day. And what specifically does that look like? Well, I think there's 3 primary ways that you could imagine Arctic economies evolving and developing in ways that really address global issues. The first of those is that it's an area of relatively plentiful fish life. And so in a world where high quality protein is much in demand, you can imagine that the Arctic will play a greater and greater role in meeting that need. With climate change, we're also finding species that were found farther south moving increasingly north, some of those into the Arctic regions. So that's one area where there is real opportunity, but the question is it possible to do that without depleting the stocks or polluting the source that the fish come from? In the second case, there is a lot of bullishness about the potential for this region to provide renewable energy, both locally, but there's very little demand, right? Because there's not large numbers of people. There's not a lot of industry development at this point. So this is primarily forms of energy that could be transported through a grid or through conversion into an energy carrier like hydrogen, for example, that could move out of the region and service the energy needs of other parts of the world. The third category is for raw materials. And these raw materials in particular that they're finding in parts of the Arctic are exactly the ones that are in most demand with the rising need for minerals in batteries and in EVs and in wind turbines and solar panels. So the desire to find new sources for these raw materials is growing all the time, and the Arctic is looked at as one place that can do it. But in all these cases, is it possible to do this and gain the economic gain of this without disrupting either the environment or the well-being of the population that actually lives there? So these are the kinds of questions that are on people's minds. Let me talk about the context a bit here. There's multiple converging challenges in the regions. One is geopolitics. With the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia being a very critical, if not the central country in the Arctic, them being engaged in warfare that's about expanding territory has huge implications for the Arctic, since the growing economic value of this land makes it ever more of interest to other countries. So those tensions are growing around all kinds of things, around territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and so forth. And that those, as I mentioned, are not just the local players, but a kind of global game that's unfolding on that front. In terms of climate, the climate in the Arctic is changing at about 4 times the pace that it is in other parts of the world. There's a variety of reasons, scientific reasons, why this region in particular, as the ice recedes and more dark ocean comes, there are feedback loops that increase the temperatures in that region faster than in other regions. Just one indication of that, between 79 and 2015, sea extent decreased by almost 5% per decade, and the thickness also dwindled by 10 to 15%. Third area, we've touched on this already, but the Arctic has not only the minerals, but also significant sources of oil and gas, in that there is enormous potential value in the biodiversity that you find in the region, whether that's in the animal species, the algae species, and so forth. There is genetic riches that are yet untapped in the region that I think are part of the conversation. And finally, I'll just broadly touch on this issue of social equity with the indigenous populations that are there. So accelerating ice melting makes it easier to access resources, but it also makes it much easier to damage these regions. A related, though I think quite separate issue, is the Arctic region has faced really significant pervasive mental health problems, especially with young people in areas that struggle with poverty. So not so different than many of the other regions around the world, where they're facing, environmental change, large-scale economic and political change, all happening in ways that really disrupt sort of traditional patterns of life. So these are the kinds of challenges that I think are operating in the region. I wanted to use the rest of my time to highlight just a few of the projects that we are doing in the region, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of issues that are coming up and the kinds of things our students are getting engaged in. In May, I offered a class called Climate and Sustainability in the Nordic Countries. We spent 6 weeks in Durham doing background reading and really coming up to speed on the course, and then about 2 weeks in country. I'm going to tell you a bit about that course. We also launched a program this year called the Arctic Sustainability Advisory Program, or ASAP, which is essentially a matchmaking service to try to link Arctic-based companies and issues with student groups that can work on some really targeted kind of consulting challenges. So those are the two that I want to talk about. I'll start with the class. The class was part of our series of global academic travel experiences called the GATE courses. This one, as I mentioned, was focused in the Nordic region, and the conceptual focus was what my slogan for the class was: 3 cities, 3 wicked problems. What I meant by that is we went to 3 different cities over those 2 weeks and dug in deep in each city to a particular challenge that city or region is facing. In Copenhagen, the focus was really, how does EU policy around climate and sustainability, which is rapidly evolving, how does it get applied or implemented in the context of a specific location like Copenhagen? So that policy to practice bridge really was the focus of what we did in Copenhagen. In Tromsø, the focus was on the future of the Arctic, much like the context that I just shared at the beginning of the presentation. I wanted my students to really dig in an experiential way in the questions about the local, but also the global and business strategy significance of the Arctic region. And then finally, Oslo, where the focus really was on the ocean economy, both traditional shipping, fishing, oil and gas, as well as some of the new types of ventures that are coming out of the region. So that was the kind of the outline of the course. Just to give you a few insights that came out of the course, the first was to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that biodiversity is actually part of the the foundational wealth of any society. And so the ocean being a source of really unique biodiversity generally, but especially in the Arctic, where you have thousands of species which have been adapted to very challenging, very cold kind of environment. The kind of adaptations that they have done end up having really significant biochemical or medical kinds of applications. So in Tromsø, we spent time at the Biotech North cluster. This was a set of organizations all co-located, which have the full supply chain from ocean science, which you see here is one of the PhD researchers from the university in Tromsø, who has a lab at the Biotech North cluster where she's doing biogenetic research and finding ways to apply that to cancer treatment, to diabetes treatment, and a number of other things where the biochemistry of the ocean has enormous potential in biochemical kinds of applications. So the idea that natural wealth can create really global markets was a theme that came up over and over during our stay in the region. The second was a family-owned fishery, which was 3 or 4 generations since its origin. It's on an island off the coast of Tromsø. So a couple of hours trip away from Tromsø, which is already a quite remote outpost in the Arctic. So this factory was very remote. It had a employee base of about 200 people from all over Europe that lived on the island and worked in the factory and ran the business divisions. This particular fishery provided about half of the organic salmon output for the whole country of Norway, so pretty significant scale. And they had both wild caught operation as well as an aquaculture operation. A few things really stood out in this visit. First of all, when they talked about community engagement, they really meant it, because it was their own employees which were the members of this community. So their effort to try to really create positive opportunities around education and entertainment and cultural enrichment with the local community were really tangible and meaningful because of their close connection to the community. Their environmental claims also made a lot of sense when you realize that that bay where that fishing operation is, if that becomes polluted, that's the end of this business. And the thing that really stood out to the students was this is a business that was explicitly committed to not grow. They believed that they were at their ecological limit in the fishing operation, both near shore as well as away from shore. And they didn't intend to grow, but they did want to continue to innovate, create higher quality products, and really, keep the ecosystem and the community as healthy as possible. So this idea of a non-growth business model, I think, was really eye-opening. For my students, there were some that had never even been in a factory. So the picture here shows my students getting their first factory tour. This visit to this place was super interesting. One of the technologies they had was an AI sensor placed in aquaculture pens that could find the salmon, could see which salmon had lice, which is a big problem in fishing industry, is fish lice. And with the AI technology, be able to zap them with lasers to kill the lice that were on the fish. So really amazing integration of high tech into a pretty hardcore traditional operation, but one that I think is producing a really interesting outcome. A third field insight was just how salient it was to recognize the rights of some of the indigenous populations in Norway. Again, a very small part of the overall population, but they have grazing rights on much of the northern part of Norway, where they graze reindeer for sale. And one of the recent projects to build wind turbines in the region went in this region, and the indigenous population sued because it encroached on their own grazing grounds. This was a case in the courts over a number of 3-4 years, and just in March of this last year was finally resolved out of court. But what it was very clear was the increased sensitivity to the needs, the expectations, and the ability to work with other stakeholders as we go through this energy transition. So what I saw was that the urgency around climate sometimes leads developers and others to not pay as much attention to the very sensitive kind of relationships to the stakeholders that are involved in these kinds of things. So we needed to resolve that tension between the climate crisis and what you might call a consent crisis. Finally, I'll just give a nod here. This is a sort of a rabbit hole you could spend a lot of time on, but we heard consistently that the regulations coming out of the EU around corporate disclosure and impact measurement are real, that they will have global consequences, and that every company in one way or another is going to have to really step up in terms of their ability to measure, report, disclose, and make progress on their environmental and social sustainability goals. Despite the kind of ups and downs in different countries around ESG, I think the move toward transparency is here to stay, and something that companies are going to have to increasingly grapple with. I've got a few more things here that I'd like to share just in terms of projects that we are doing through this Arctic Sustainable Advisory Program, ASAP. And as I mentioned, this is a consulting project-focused initiative. We're working with the Arctic Economic Council, the Wilson Center, and other stakeholders to try to recruit companies from the Arctic to work with our students around targeted needs in those companies. These could be technical challenges, they could be new ventures that the company's trying to pursue, or it could be around solving some kind of internal challenge. And just to give you a little flavor, these are the companies that we reached out to. We had a large list of companies in Greenland. Many of these are pretty small scale, but these are contacts that are doing really interesting sustainability or climate related work. Everything from larger airlines that are doing decarbonization programs and sustainable aviation fuel to seafood companies trying to really reduce bycatch. There's a whole set of different questions that came up among these prospective companies. And we were able to then sort of do a triage to get some of these to be done by Duke, others to be done by MIT. We sorted these according to where our strengths were, and we're beginning to really build a platform that will allow for Arctic companies to have much easier access to resources they probably never would have access to otherwise. So this opportunity to have our students have really rich learning experiences by engaging these companies, there's also really a big need on the company side to access talent that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. I'll give you just a few examples, then we'll wrap and we'll open up for questions. The first is the Iceland Ocean Cluster. This is an organization started several years ago where they realized that some of the applications for fish waste, or what was left over after you took the fillet from a codfish, for example, might actually have more economic value. This was the seed of an idea which grew over a decade into a set of applications where they're using fish skins as a raw material to produce bandaging material, which are used on diabetic victims or fire victims. This fish skin-based bandaging is got a lot of healing properties because of the collagen in the skin. It's flexible because of the nature of skin being made to be able to flex easily. It's less likely to be rejected than things that aren't based on organic materials. And this business has grown now. It just was recently acquired by a Danish company for $1.3 billion. So the company called Caresis is this unicorn company in the blue economy space that I think shows the potential to really rethink some of these traditional industries and identify new kinds of opportunities to create value. The Iceland Ocean Cluster is building on that with this idea of 100% fish, that not only just for bandaging, but for everything from perfumes to packaging, you could use the raw material of the fishing industry, the waste material, and turn it into higher value add kinds of products that you could sell in the marketplace. Second project is Nuna Green. This is the state utility in Greenland who recently decided that they were not going to pursue oil and gas as their primary source of energy. They have a large hydro facility, but to get energy, to get electricity in some of the more distant villages, they needed a new solution. Building a new hydro dam was too expensive. So this project looked at the feasibility of using green hydrogen produced from the hydropower in the capital city and then using ships to deliver that green hydrogen to these distant locations. A third project is CarbFix, which is a company that takes captured carbon either from a factory or directly from the air and runs it through a mineralization process that creates essentially a mineral substrate that sequesters the carbon and buries it in deep ground chambers so that it would stay out of the atmosphere forever. So CarbFix is a really fast growing company that's looking at multiple ways of closing the loop on carbon emissions through carbon removal. And finally, I'll just wrap on this. The last project, which we're really just beginning and still exploring this. I have a call tomorrow with them to work this out. RevOcean is a company that has a world-class science expedition ship that's being made as we speak. It will launch about a year from now, and the ship will be on a global tour all year long to different parts of the global ocean in order to do scientific research, but also to engage stakeholders and really solve ocean problems. So you can imagine having a workshop on this ship, because the ship holds about 100 people. 50 of those are crew. You could imagine 50 people being brought together for a workshop on this boat for 4 or 5 days with an output of how to manage trash pollution in the Caribbean, for example. Plastic pollution. So RevOcean is really an engagement platform to get the right stakeholders brought together around big ocean challenges. So this is a project that we're just beginning. I'm going to wrap here. My conclusion, there is a path to sustainable development. And there's a lot of compelling reasons why the Arctic is appealing. But the kind of standards for environmental and social engagement have to be much higher than what historically we've done in the past. Local needs really need to be centered in that process. And the only way we're really going to find a way to crack the code on sustainable development is through multi-sector partnerships where business, government, and civil society find new ways to work together around these opportunities and these challenges. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you. I encourage any of you to put your questions in the LinkedIn box. I'm happy to take any questions for the remainder of the time that we have here. I'm also happy to pick up a conversation with any of you. You can find me on the EDGE website on Fuqua, so edge.fuqua.edu. And you could find a way to contact me there if you'd like to continue this conversation. But I'll open it up to see if you have questions about what we've discussed today. So I got a question about the relationship between the Arctic Council and individual nations. The Arctic Council is more of a UN type organization in the sense that it doesn't have real governance power. It doesn't have the ability to coerce countries to do anything other than what they would do otherwise. The sovereignty of the nations really is held at that national level. But the Arctic Council allows for the identification of where there's shared interests, there's need for cooperation, either about big challenges that the region faces or opportunities that they could pursue together. So it's really like the U.S. relationship to the UN is what the relationship would be between, say, a Norway and the Arctic Council. The head of the Arctic Council also rotates every year. So they are able to sort of bring more of a national vision to that in leadership, but always in a collaborative way with the other countries. Other questions? Maybe I'll just circle back on this question of, is the Arctic at a tipping point? I think in a lot of ways it is, that there is large scale changes, some of which are happening in its ecosystems, some of it that's happening in society. And I think there's big questions about how rapidly this region can go through that transformation and how successfully they can be in holding on to the assets that really matter. I remain bullish from my, actually more bullish from the experience I had working with companies that were based in the region, that these issues of environmental and social, sustainability are really front and center for them. So I think that it makes sense for us to find ways to support those companies that operate in the region to really think hard about the consequences of their supply chain choices and their operational choices. I think that's going to be really important. And maybe I'll just end here. I've got a comment from uh, uh, somebody who asks, curious if you can explain how they plan to transport the hydrogen in Greenland. Is the plan to have an electrolyzer co-located with the hydro plant and then ship elsewhere? Yeah, that is the idea. Essentially, that the investment would be in electrolysis machines that would be co-located at the hydro dam. You'd be able to fill those with hydrogen produced from 100% green energy source, and then put those on a ship to take to the region. So there is some carbon footprint depending on what the shipping arrangement is, but essentially that's a way to decarbonize fossil fuel options, and also allow for lower scale, sort of gradually building energy supplies versus a huge new hydro dam that would be several $billions and also probably a couple of decades in the making. So that's the kind of issue that's happening here. And maybe I'll just take one more question and then we can conclude. So Joe Murray asks, it seems inevitable that geopolitical tensions will continue to rise in the region as these different countries, Russia, China, US, compete for influence and access. What do you think is the role business should play in balancing these tensions while exploring possibilities to support zero carbon solutions in the region? Yeah, I think you've articulated the challenge here. I think it's what I would suggest is that I think business needs to play a much more active and constructive role in policy engagement. There's this idea in my field of corporate political responsibility. I think this is a powerful idea. Historically, companies have really thought about policy engagement only in terms of their own interests, lobbying for specific things that advantage the business. I think we need a different kind of political engagement between companies and policymakers in identifying these areas of shared interest, sustainable development of the Arctic, and really thinking about what's the right kind of construct for a partnership between the different sectors to do this in a way that has integrity, that honors the precautionary principle, and that creates, positive economic outcomes both for the local population and the investors, but also doesn't ultimately undermine the kind of long-term sustainability of the region. So I think those are really, really good questions. I welcome any of you to open up a conversation with me. I'd love to continue to discuss this. I've become a real Arctic fan, really passionate about this issue. I'll be teaching this class on climate and sustainability in the Nordic regions again next year. So I'm also interested if any of you have contacts in the region that you'd like to connect us. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the region. We have a stake in it in the US and many other parts of the world. Even if you aren't in the Arctic, I think we all have a huge stake in the future of the Arctic. So thanks for your time today.